Hi folks, welcome to Lecture 10, Modern Monetary Theory, our last lecture. We've covered a hell of a lot of ground from the end of feudalism to all the way to pandemic responses and modern monetary theory, so well done. Okay, so in this lecture, I want to present modern monetary theory as clearly as I can. My problems with MMT and Keynesian economics in general have always been the problems exposed by the stagflation of the 70s. Where the economy blew up because of high debts and high wages, creating runaway inflation. So I've personally really enjoyed the opportunity to really drill down deep to see what the Keynesian or post-Keynesian or the MMT answer to the stagflation problem is. And so you'll see from this lecture that the whole history of the capitalist world, from the late 1800s or whatever, all the way right through to right now, there has been a back and forth constantly between experimentations with liberal laissez-faire capitalism and then a return to more Keynesian approaches, and back and forth again, right? And so we've been living in a neoliberal or a new liberal policy orientation since the start of the 80s, and why that occurred is because of the stagflation of the 70s. So we've switched back and forth in response to economic meltdowns, right? And so we're right back at that point again, where the policy settings we've been running on since the 80s are now being questioned because of another financial meltdown. So interesting times, really interesting times. Okay, so if you remember, when the Great Depression began, it was made much worse by the laissez-faire or the liberal idea that the cure for an economic downturn was actually pro-cyclical austerity, right? So raising rates and cutting spending in order to force wages and prices down far enough that a profit was able to be made again. And so then investors would invest and hire people, and export competitiveness would be restored. And as exports rose, so would gold reserves and the economy. But in the Great Depression, what was supposed to be a short, sharp dose of pain to restore balance ground on for years and years, and because demand collapsed, right, and the investment-driven recovery just wasn't happening, right? I mean, who builds a new factory in the middle of a depression, right? It's a trap that economies can fall into when you just have a complete collapse of demand. So this downward spiral where unemployment in some US cities hit 90%, right? So this downward spiral was only stabilized and then eventually ended when governments went off the gold standard fix, which allowed them to the freedom to have counter-cyclical spending to get the economy moving again. Whereas when they were trying to defend a fix, they didn't have that freedom. So the quicker countries went off the gold standard and started counter-cyclical spending, the quicker their economies recovered. There's a really close correlation between that. And because tax revenue goes down in a downturn, right? People are working less and there's people are buying less, etc. Because tax revenues goes down, plus if you're going to do counter-cyclical spending to get the economy going, then your expenses are going to go up as a government. So counter-cyclical spending is necessarily, it's almost certainly going to be deficit spending, right? There's going to be a shortfall between tax revenue, tax income for the government, and the amount of money that it's spending, right? So counter-cyclical government spending is normally going to be deficit spending, and so FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, won the 1933 election promising a New Deal. Counter-cyclical government spending in what became known as Keynesianism within economics. FDR's New Deal put something like 8.5 million people to work in something like 35,000 different major projects, right? So, bridges and dams and ports and highways and roads and murals and artwork and conservation projects and schools and hospitals and whatever the local area could benefit from, right? And all of US infrastructure is really built on FDR's New Deal, right? There probably hasn't been, there hasn't been a major injection into infrastructure since, right? And a lot of the US infrastructure is actually crumbling a little bit. So this idea of counter-cyclical deficit spending to restore and maintain something close to full employment was the accepted orthodoxy within economics and certainly within the political parties between 1933 and 1979, right? For both sides of the political fence. Then you'll recall that starting in 1973, the US saw a period of stagflation where you have both high inflation and high unemployment. And this recession saw the Democratic President Jimmy Carter appoint Paul Volcker to be the head of the Federal Reserve in 1979. And Volcker raised interest rates to 20% and left them there for 3 years, right? In an attempt to bring inflation down. So if those interest rates were the cure, it was certainly not a quick cure, right? It wasn't an overnight quick fix. So, and I'll get to that in a minute. But Carter lost the 1981 election to Reagan, who is remembered for moving the Republicans away from Keynesianism and returning to liberal economic ideas. But it's important to understand that Jimmy Carter was actually the first to move, right? To move away from Keynesianism. So from 1979 to today, both sides of the political party, at least in the US and the Western world, really is, both sides are very liberal in their economic policies. it's important to separate liberal in the values sense from liberal in the economic sense, right? So liberal values might be like pro-abortion and pro-gay marriage, and so Democrat sort of culture side of the culture wars, and Republicans, having more of a conservative moral stance, I suppose. But both Democrats and Republicans are completely neoliberal in their economics, and Bill Clinton was probably more neoliberal than Reagan. If you look at signing NAFTA and admitting China to the WTO, many would argue that Bill Clinton was the most neoliberal president the US has ever had, or at least since before World War I. And certainly now Obama and now Biden, the Democratic Party in the US is much more liberal than Trump actually is. Trump is giving some big tax cuts to the rich, but Obama bailed the rich out, right? And you can bet that Trump will make that argument in the election, that he's the one that's actually trying to protect working class jobs and bring them back home, because he's starting a trade war and renegotiated NAFTA. He might even win based on that, right? It's something the Democratic Party has doubled down on the neoliberal economic stance, right? Rather than, say, moving to a Keynesian set of policies like Bernie Sanders probably would have brought in. Anyway, I digress. So the point is that the stagflation of the 70s drove a move away from counter-cyclical deficit spending in order to maintain employment. The 70s drove policy away from that idea. Let me play a 5-minute clip of Ronald Reagan 2 weeks after taking office. He's at the height of his powers, an impressive, completely convincing speaker, right? And this is probably his most important speech. Maybe the tear down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev, might be more important, but certainly in terms of domestic or even Western world economic policy, this is really, really important. I can only play you a 5-minute clip of the 20-minute clip, but either way, the effects of this speech are still very much with us right here and now. Okay, so here, have a listen.
The problem isn't who to blame, it's what to blame. So tonight, let's forget about party politics and take a look at how our country got into this fix and what we can do to get her out of it. When I said this problem was years in the making, I wasn't just using a figure of speech. This chart shows you what I mean. You see that red line? It represents the rate of unemployment from 1968 through the present, and it tells us two important things. First of all, it's a jagged line representing rises and dips in unemployment as our economy passed through boom periods and bust periods over the past decade. This reminds us that the current recession is part of a long series, a series that hasn't stopped because in the past, when the crunch came, too many in government resorted to quick fixes instead of getting to the root cause. Each time they applied the quick fixes, unemployment dipped for a while, only to take off again. In that sense, you could say that we've been on a decade-long roller coaster ride. The only difference is that on a roller coaster, you end up on solid ground once the ride is over. As you can see from the chart, while unemployment zigzagged from year to year, its long-term direction kept notching upward. Notice that each so-called recovery left unemployment higher than before the recession. In 1968, unemployment stood at 3.6%. In 1971, it shot up to 5.9%. Then it started coming down again, but instead of going all the way back to 3.6%, it bottomed out at 4.9%. In 1974, it started shooting up again, and the same thing happened. It bottomed out at a higher level than before. In other words, for all its short-term ups and downs, the unemployment roller coaster was really an escalator, edging its way up the charts throughout the last decade. Unless we reverse that trend, it can only get worse, not just for us, but for our children and grandchildren. Now, let's look at what's behind this bad trend in unemployment. What's been causing it for over a decade? A second chart tells much of the story. But before we look at it, I'll bet many of you have already come up with the answer. It's a phenomenon that last year a majority of Americans correctly identified as our single most pressing long-term problem: inflation. Inflation and the high interest rates it leads to are the real culprits. They create the economic climate that leads to unemployment. This blue line represents inflation. Like unemployment, inflation has zigzagged over the last decade. But you can see that up to now, the long-term trend has been upwards. Again, as with unemployment, the old quick fixes simply did not work. Each time they were applied, they gave a little temporary relief to the patient, but left him weaker than he was before. It's a consistent pattern. Each time inflation has shot up since 1969, there has been a deadly delayed reaction of rising unemployment. Inflation is like a virus in the economic bloodstream, sometimes dormant and sometimes active, but leaving the patient weaker after every new attack. My fellow Americans, we've got to stop these trend lines to disaster. To do that, we have to understand what causes them. Well, for starters, our federal government has been living beyond its means for more than a generation. One of the wisest of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, warned that the public debt is the greatest of dangers to be feared. He believed that it was wrong for one generation to forever burden the generations yet to come. And for the first 150 years of our history, our leaders heeded Jefferson's warning. But not lately. In our lifetimes, we've seen government spending rage out of control. We've only had one balanced budget in the last 22 years. So now we're staggering under $1 trillion debt. This year, before government can spend one dime to feed the hungry, care for the sick, or protect our freedom, it must plan to spend $110 billion just to pay interest on that debt. And still, the big spenders wonder why the American people want what a stubborn minority in the House of Representatives denied them just 12 days ago: a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. All of this government spending and red ink can only spawn higher taxes and whopping deficits, which for nearly 2 decades led to inflationary increases in the money supply. Inflation and massive government borrowing drive up interest rates. That makes it difficult or impossible for families to get the credit they need to buy homes, cars, and appliances, or for businesses to invest in greater productivity. And ultimately, inflation leads to recession and unemployment.
So whatever your politics, Reagan was an amazing presenter. Right? He very convincing, and it's a convincing story, right? The lesson we learnt from the stagflation of the 70s was that full employment can't be a long-term goal, because what will happen is that full employment means that for employers to get someone to work for them, they need to offer better wages and conditions than the current job that person is in, right? So this automatically drives wages higher. The higher wages are passed on to customers in the form of higher prices for the things they buy. Workers see the higher prices for things and demand pay rises, right? Which are then passed on to the customer, driving prices and wages higher, right? So you have this inflationary spiral. And this inflationary spiral can build up speed until it causes a recession due to investors' savings evaporating. And the sticky wages due to unions and big business that we've talked about before mean that this recession would increase unemployment without decreasing inflation. So what's called stagflation, right, where you've got high unemployment and high inflation. So the liberal economics view is that there has to be a certain relatively high level of unemployment maintained in the economy, or it will start this inflationary spiral, right? If you have labour markets that are too tight, then there tends to be a bidding war for labour, which starts this inflationary spiral. So to avoid this inflationary spiral, the Federal Reserve and the government had to maintain a certain level of unemployment, right? And so this is called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, right? So or NAIRU, and the NAIRU was saying that 5 or 7 or 10% unemployment is the limit that an economy can handle, and once it goes over that, labour markets become too tight and wages start blowing out, right? And so this rate was normally thought close to 10%, right? So, between 5 and 10% was thought to be the natural rate of unemployment that it was needed to keep an economy from overheating. And so the underlying belief was that you've got to have this pool of unemployed people in order to avoid inflation, and to maintain this natural rate of unemployment. The Liberal playbook called for a set of policies. If you remember this slide from lecture 6, this is the neoliberal policy settings that the IMF imposed on the import substituting developing countries that went broke because they borrowed in a foreign currency. Many of these are aimed at shrinking the size and the role of government drastically in order to afford tax cuts, as tax cuts are really the only stimulus that is possible under a liberal regime, right, other than lowering rates. And all of these neoliberal policy settings are designed to avoid wage inflation, right? But no politician or even public economist will talk about needing to maintain 5 to 10% of citizens as unemployed in order to do this, right? That would be political suicide. Instead, the discussion focuses on fighting inflation, not the belief that relatively high unemployment is needed to do that, right? That link is very rarely made, explicitly anyway. So you'll see that these measures have all these measures have a direct effect on wages and employment. So, for example, the removal of capital controls is very important. The Keynesian approach was to stop capital escaping, so that it was forced to reinvest in the domestic economy, right? And hire from the domestic economy, and creating jobs and economic growth. But the liberal or the neoliberal approach is to allow capital to escape and invest elsewhere in the world. This more than any other policy setting has weakened the bargaining power of labour, right? If labour gets too expensive, then capital can simply go elsewhere and offshore the jobs, right? eliminating subsidies on essentials like food and petrol, and cutting social services and welfare payments makes all of that it's designed to lower the cost of government so that you can lower taxes, but it's also designed to make being unemployed very uncomfortable, right? You don't want people sitting on the dole being happy, right? They have to be motivated to work, and they have to be motivated enough that they will bid wages down rather than bidding them up, right? So that's very important. And in the same way, privatising government functions, so water and electricity, even roads and sewerage, it's all justified with arguments about governments being inefficient, and privatising will see prices drop and cut the cost of government so that taxes can be cut. And even regulatory functions are privatised as much as possible. So we looked at the role of ratings agencies in the lecture about the GFC. So you have a market-based sort of regulatory system of Standard & Poor's and Moody's giving ratings for these financial products, right? Rather than a government enforcing rules about the quality of these financial products. Though I must say that even die-hard liberal economists are now rethinking privatisation especially of essentials, as it's almost universally led to higher prices for water and electricity, and etc., and lower reliability in most places too. Australia can certainly be used as an example of that. Anyway, explaining these policies truthfully as ways to maintain a reasonably high level of unemployment by not responding to downturns with counter-cyclical deficit spending, and even raising rates to keep people unemployed, which is the same as keeping inflation low, right? And cutting services and welfare, all of that, saying that would be political suicide. So inflation becomes the reason why cuts are necessary, without exactly explaining why. And I'm not saying that liberals were doing this because they were evil or heartless or something. They were doing this in the sincere belief that this is necessary to avoid economic meltdowns, right? Like they sincerely believe this, and I probably, I'm on the fence about it too, right? And so it's not at least in this class, it's not a debate about them over morals, right? Which side is more moral? It's a debate about what works, right? What works to give the most people possible the highest standard of living possible for the longest time possible, right? And sometimes that might involve hard choices. And the stagflation of the 70s taught us clearly, apparently, that deficit spending by governments to keep the economy at full employment causes inflation to spiral out of control. However, that explanation does have some weaknesses, and in fact, I would probably say now that I at least am convinced that explanation is wrong. So if you look at this graph where inflation is in the purple, unemployment is in the blue, and interest rates are in orange, you can see that from 1960 to 1973, you've got Keynesian counter-cyclical rates being used. So responding to rising unemployment in the early 60s with dropping rates, and then When unemployment drops below 4%, the rates are lifted. So not zero, right? We talk about a policy target of full employment, but you know, in practical terms, Keynesians, would take 4% or around there as full employment probably. So the rates are lifted and everything's going fine. And the unemployment rate is actually quite high in 71, right? And 72, so between 5 and 6%. And inflation is quite low at around 3.4%. So the inflationary spiral that began in the mid-1973 wasn't triggered by very low unemployment driving inflation higher and higher. That liberal story of what triggered the 70s stagflation doesn't actually fit the data. What we see is the oil embargo imposed by the OPEC countries on the US and its allies. So, zero sales to those countries of oil. You can imagine what that's like, right? It just grinds your economy to a halt very quickly. So the oil embargo imposed by OPEC on the US and its allies drive inflation to record levels really quickly. The cost of oil goes up by 400%. And oil is an essential, right? It's in everything. Even in the most natural products, right? Like food or something, it's still got to be transported from the farm to the shop and then to your house, right? You've still got to cook it, and even the growing of it, right? Tractors and cars and harvesters. Oil is in everything. It is the universal essential. So this oil going up by 400% almost overnight, and just not being available for most consumers, right? Like petrol was being rationed, and so this drives inflation to record levels, and unemployment follows it up, right? So, and before the inflation rate has fallen back to its previous levels, the second oil shock of the Iranian Shiite revolution happens in 78, and then in 79 Iraq invades them because they think that they're distracted with the revolution, and so markets freak out again. Oil jumps by 250%, driving inflation up again, right? So you've got these massive oil shocks at the beginning and the end of the 70s that are the cause of the inflation. It wasn't very low unemployment that was the trigger. So, pointing to the 1970s stagflation and saying that this proves that counter-cyclical deficit spending and full employment as a policy goal triggers inflationary spirals, it just doesn't fit the data, right? It doesn't fit the timing of it. And we can see from this graph that it wasn't high interest rates that ended the 1970s inflation. That they may have helped to lower demand, but it was the price of oil dropping drastically as the high prices of the 70s caused an exploration boom that actually led to an oil glut in the 80s. So you can see that as part of the problem, especially for the 1973 embargo was that the US output had already peaked and it had become, it needed imports. And the other European countries and many, Canada, I think some African countries had sort of hit their limits, right, on their production. So there was no other substitute able to come online quickly for the OPEC oil. But those high prices made exploration and so deep water stuff, and it created a flurry of exploration and building new rigs and drilling. So that oil started to come online in the mid-80s, right? And that is really the root solution, the underlying cause for why inflation dropped back down again, right? So the Volcker's 20% interest rates might not have had much to do with it, right? Inflation went up because there was an oil shortage, and inflation went down because the shortage was reversed by the supply of oil beginning to outstrip demand again in 1985. So, and that boom of exploration, it kept oil prices low, for 20 years until the China boom sort of took off, right? So the stagflation story isn't the knockdown argument that most people assume it is, or certainly until writing this lecture, I had assumed it was a knockdown argument, right? And I had dismissed MMT with no further thought, really, because I thought the lesson of the 70s stagflation was that full employment eventually blew the economy up, and that's not actually what happened. The other reason why I've always dismissed full employment as a policy target is that the deficit spending required to achieve that has always struck me as a major problem, as the debt needs to be paid off, right? The debt needs to be paid off by future generations too. And even now, it seems very uncertain whether many countries will be able to afford the retirement pensions that they've promised their citizens when the system was designed when people died at around 65 years of age, and now the average is more like 100, right? So there is a major problem with a gap between the revenue and the just on pensions, let alone doing other spending to keep unemployment artificially low. So if we don't pay down the deficits in the rich Western countries that have very generous pension plans, we could all very easily go broke, right? So the deficit is a problem, and so increasing it with anything is dangerous, right? That's the assumption, and that view is shared by both sides of politics throughout the Western world. To illustrate that, let me play you a clip of the 2012 presidential debate in the US.
I think it's not just an economic issue. I think it's a moral issue. I think it's frankly not moral for my generation to keep spending massively more than we take in, knowing those burdens are going to be passed on to the next generation. And they're going to be paying the interest and the principal all their lives. And the amount of debt we're adding at $1 trillion a year is simply not moral. So how do we deal with it? Well, mathematically, there are three ways that you can cut it a deficit. One, of course, is to raise taxes. Number two is to cut spending, and number three is to grow the economy. Because if more people work in a growing economy, they're paying taxes, and you can get the job done that way. The president would prefer raising taxes. I understand. The problem with raising taxes is that it slows down the rate of growth, and you could never quite get the job done. I want to lower spending and encourage economic growth at the same time. What things would I cut from spending? Well, first of all, I will eliminate all programs by this test if they don't pass it. Is the program so critical it's worth borrowing money from China to pay for it? And if not, I'll get rid of it. Obamacare's on my list. I apologize, Mr. President. I use that term with all respect, by the way. Good. Okay, good. So I'll get rid of that. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you too. But I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for. So that's number one. Number two, I'll take programs that are currently good programs, but I think could be run more efficiently at the state level and send them to the state. Number three, I'll make government more efficient and to cut back the number of employees, combine some agencies and departments. My cutbacks will be done through attrition, by the way. This is the approach we have to take to get America to a balanced budget.
When I walked into the Oval Office, I had more than $1 trillion deficit greeting me. And we know where it came from. 2 wars that were paid for on a credit card, 2 tax cuts that were not paid for, and a whole bunch of programs that were not paid for, and then a massive economic crisis. And despite that, what we've said is, yes, we had to take some initial emergency measures to make sure we didn't slip into a Great Depression. But what we've also said is, let's make sure that we are cutting out those things that are not helping us grow. So 77 government programs, everything from aircrafts that the Air Force had ordered but weren't working very well. 18 government programs for education that were well-intentioned but weren't helping kids learn. We went after medical fraud in Medicare and Medicaid very aggressively, more aggressively than ever before, and have saved tens of billions of dollars, $50 billion of waste taken out of the system. And I worked with Democrats and Republicans to cut $1 trillion out of our discretionary domestic budget. That's the largest cut in the discretionary domestic budget since Dwight Eisenhower. Now, we all know that we've got to do more. And so I put forward a specific $4 trillion deficit reduction plan. It's on a website. You can look at all the numbers, what cuts we make and what revenue we raise. And the way we do it is $2.50 for every cut. We ask for $1 of additional revenue, paid for, as I indicated earlier, by asking those of us who have done very well in this country to contribute a little bit more to reduce the deficit.
So both sides of politics are very concerned about deficits, and so they should be, right? All advanced economies have a deficit problem. If we just look at pensions, we have a major problem on the horizon, right? If we make the pretty reasonable assumption that an old age pension needs to be about 70% of the minimum wage in any particular country, right? For someone to be able to live on it, right? Then the gap between the money that will be required to pay old age pensions and the money governments will have to pay them will be something like 224 trillion in the top 6 largest pension plans. So that's Australia, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, the UK, and the US, right? 224 trillion. And if you added in India and China, right, then it blows out to something like 400 trillion by 2050. 400 trillion, right? Like that's 5 times bigger than the whole global economy, right? Like I'm not the trajectory we're on. I'm not sure that this is going to be solvable, right? So this is going to be a problem for every society that doesn't want their old people to starve like they used to and still do in many countries. So if MMT wants us to return to counter-cyclical deficit spending, then they need to explain how they will pay that debt off, because we're already heading into a future where government debt in every advanced economy is going to blow the system up, right? We're in trouble now. Like, our governments are really broke now. And that's without expanding government deficit spending to maintain full employment, right? So MMT needs to explain where that money is coming from. So let me play you a clip from Margaret Thatcher explaining the essence of the problem.
One of the great debates of our time is about how much of your money should be spent by the state and how much you should keep to spend on your family. Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money. And prosperity won't come by inventing more and more lavish public expenditure programs. You don't grow richer by ordering another checkbook from the bank. And no nation ever grew more prosperous by taxing its citizens beyond their capacity to pay. We have a duty to make sure that every penny piece we raise in taxation is spent wisely and well. For it is our party which is dedicated to good housekeeping. Indeed, I wouldn't mind betting that if Mr. Gladstone were alive today, he'd be reapplying to join the Conservative Party. Protecting the taxpayer's purse, protecting the public services. These are our two great tasks, and their demands have to be reconciled. How very pleasant it would be, how very popular to say, spend more on this, expand more on that. And of course we all have our favorite causes. I know I do. But someone has to add up the figures. Every business has to do it, every housewife has to do it, every government should do it, and this one will.
It's strange to see politicians that are impressive, convincing, powerful speakers, right? Haven't sort of seen much of that in the age of Trump. But so if government wants to spend more, Thatcher said that they can only do so by borrowing people's money or taxing them more. The state has no source of money other than the money that people earn themselves. But MMT says that this idea about taxes paying for government spending is actually completely wrong. MMT says that taxes aren't about funding the government. The government doesn't need funding because it's the issuer of the currency. It can print as much money as it likes, which is true, right? It's obviously true. Thatcher does have that backwards. The source of money in an economy is not the people, it's the government. The government is not a user of the currency like everyone else. Users of the currency have to fund expenses with income or borrowing. But governments could print money to pay its bills, right? That's obviously true. They print the money, right? And many governments have printed money to pay the bills in the past, right? But the reason governments don't do that is because printing money devalues your currency and it causes inflation, right? So you've got the lady using banknotes to as fuel for a heating fire, right? Because inflation has got out of control, and so printing money causes inflation, right? And if a government was to print as much money as it wanted, it would cause hyperinflation, like we've seen in Germany and in much of Europe after World War One, and in places like Zimbabwe. So that's why That's why government deficits are funded by government borrowing, right? Because printing money devalues your currency and causes inflation. Well, MMT points out that unless your currency is fixed, devaluing doesn't really matter that much. In fact, devaluing is what governments try and do to boost their economies, right? It helps your trade balance. And as long as you are a reasonably large, diversified economy like Australia, and haven't done anything silly like borrow large amounts in a foreign currency, then if you have a floating currency and the value of your currency compared to others is not something that the government really has to worry that much about. But inflation is something that governments should worry about and do. But MMT points out that inflation actually has two sides to it, and they both have to be present for inflation to happen. So, as Reagan said in his speech, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Right? So there has to be a scarcity, and in fact, even though our currency isn't fixed to gold or the US dollar or something anymore, there is still MMT says that there is still a limit. We can't just print money endlessly, but that limit isn't a self-imposed one like a gold fix or something, or relative to other economies. What it is the fix is we have a fixed amount of labour and human capital and resources that if we push the money supply past the point where all of those resources are employed, then we can see inflation, right? So it's not just that people getting richer will bid prices up. There has to be a shortage, right? If there's a surplus, then inflation won't happen. A surplus of goods. So, for example, think of it this way: if I'm buying a $20,000 car, I'm at the car yard, I'm looking at it, I've taken it for a test drive, I'm about to buy it, and my boss rings me and tells me that I'm getting a raise, right? Happy days. And I get off the phone and I'm talking to the salesman, and I say, look, I know you'll take $20,000 for it, but my boss has just made me richer. I've got a pay rise. How about I give you $25,000 instead? Just because I'm richer, right? That is not how that happens at all, right? But if that was the last of that type of car, right? So it was I don't know, something rare and exotic or whatever, and it's the last one in existence, then there could be a bidding war for that car, right? So there has to be a scarcity involved, and it has to be something that isn't easily replaced with substitutes, right? And so that idea of substitution gets at what's called price elasticity, right? So for a normal good, if you raise the price of it, then the quantity demanded of it will decrease, right? You raise the price of the price of football tickets, right? You double the price of football tickets, then the amount of people that want to buy them will decrease because it's it's a luxury product or whatever, right? It's not an essential. But if something is an essential good, then no matter how high the price goes, the quantity demanded will decrease by less, right? You could have something that is perfectly inelastic, right? But essentials are very inelastic in their demand. So there has to be scarcity before money printing will cause inflation. A reduction in the supply of something is represented on the graph on the left as S1 going to S2, right? Like supply has decreased. But that is a normal good, and so the quantity decreases by the same sort of amount. But the graph on the right, you see that there's a 40% price increase, but only a 10% decrease in demand, because that is a more essential good, something that can't be replaced. So money printing doesn't automatically cause inflation. There has to be some sort of scarcity, and there has to be something reasonably essential too, right? The government could print money without causing inflation as long as there is a surplus or replacements for everything that everyone wanted to buy, right? And this is understood by even the most hardcore neoliberal economists. Let me play you a clip of Alan Greenspan, who you probably know was the US Federal Reserve chairman from 87 to 2006. And he really drove the neoliberal economics that we see in the Reagan era and the Clinton and the Bush era. So let me play this clip for you.
So having personal retirement accounts is another way of making a future retiree benefits more secure for their retirement. And also, do you believe that personal retirement accounts as a component to a system of solvency does help improve solvency? Because when you have a personal retirement account policy, it's accompanied with a benefit offset. With that feature in place, do you believe that personal retirement accounts can help us achieve solvency for the system and make those future retiree benefits more secure?
Well, I wouldn't say that the pay-as-you-go benefits are insecure in the sense that there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. The question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created which those benefits are employed to purchase? So it's not a question of security. It's a question of the structure of a financial system which assures that the real resources are created for retirement as distinct from the cash. The cash itself is nice to have, but it's got to be in the context of the real resources being created at the time those benefits are paid, so that you can purchase real resources with the benefits, which of course are cash.
Mm-hmm.
From the look on his face, I'm fairly sure that Paul Ryan, the guy asking the question there, did not understand Alan Greenspan's answer at all. Though I am hoping that you understood it, right? So what Greenspan was saying is that the government can print money to pay its bills. That's not the problem. The size of the gap between the tax revenue the government receives and the government's promises for pensions, that gap doesn't matter, right? The pension system is secure in the sense that governments can't go broke, right? Where there's often a fear that we're all going to end up like Greece or something, right, where we go broke. But our government can't go broke in the same way as Greece and Ireland. But the whole EU, all of the EU countries have given up their monetary sovereignty. So they're issuing government bonds in a currency that they don't print, right? Greek government bonds have a very high default risk, whereas Australian government bonds have zero default risk, right? Because we print our own currency, right? So paying for things is not the problem. What matters is the amount of stuff in the economy needs to be sufficient to meet the demand of those pensioners, right? When they go to spend their pensions, in 2050. So there's two sides to inflation, and they both have to be present. So money and scarcity. And as long as your economy isn't full of monopolies, right? So you have reasonably competitive markets. More people earning more money won't drive prices up unless there's a shortage of something. So, in countries, if countries can't go broke and they can print money without causing inflation up until the point where they're at full employment and they can't go past that, but they can print money up until that point without causing inflation. So if we think of Europe, the classic hyper inflation example, Germany and other countries, they were facing incredible shortages of everything, right? Cities in ruins, all the farms are bombed out, and all the farmers are dead, and so of course you're going to have a bidding war in a situation where there's that much shortage, right? Like how much would you pay for a loaf of bread if your family was starving, right? And printing money in that situation where there's a shortage of essentials, we'll just see the price of essentials get bid up, right? But it's not really the money printing that's the problem. It's really the scarcity that causes inflation, with or without money printing. So the real problem is the scarcity problem. But if that is true, then what's the point of taxes at all, or borrowing to fund government deficits? Like, why doesn't the government just print money? Why tax and borrow at all? Well, MMT points out that taxes and borrowing by the government, so selling government bonds is how governments borrow. MMT points out that taxing and borrowing isn't actually about paying for government spending. Taxing and borrowing is really about managing interest rates and the money supply. It's about taking cash in and out of the economy through taxes and borrowing. So that's how the government controls inflation, right? If they keep spending past full employment or some other limits within the economy, then that will start inflation rising, and they will need to dial back the money supply, right? And they can do this by raising taxes, cutting spending, or borrowing money, right? But it's not the purpose of those things isn't, they're not a household. They're not raising their income, raising taxes and cutting spending and borrowing money because they could go broke, or they need the money. They print the money. They can pay for all this stuff. What it is it's about controlling inflation, because and inflation happens because you're reaching some sorts of limits within the economy, within the society. So, but it's not about paying for spending or for deficits. Government deficits in that regard don't matter, right? or at least not in the way commonly understood. As the issuer of the currency, the government cannot go broke, and it can spend on services or creating jobs or cutting taxes or whatever up until the point where inflation starts creeping up, and then it needs to take money out of the system. So, like Greenspan said, the problem is in making sure that the economy is productive enough for all the spending that is desired to happen without there being any shortages, especially shortages of essentials like oil, right? So we will need to expand the economy, so the stuff that we make, we will need to expand that while doing so with a declining number of workers as the boomers retire, right? So that's going to be a real challenge. We need to avoid another shock, another supply shock like the 70s, right? That's the policy task that we need to be focusing on, not paying off deficits that they might not matter at all, right? So what would MMT have done about the stagflation of the 1970s? Well, I'm not sure it could have done anything about the inflation, as it was caused by a shortage of an essential, right? But it needn't have been a stagflation event where unemployment rose as well as inflation, right? The government could have given all the unemployed people a job and solved the unemployment problem. But other than bringing in more oil, right, bringing more supplies online, or finding substitutes like the Germans did World War II for a time, the shortage of oil is the cause of the widespread inflation, and so it couldn't be solved until more oil came online, right? Maybe you could have had some sort of rationing, and they did, right? All these cars are only able to buy a certain amount, right? Certainly the US became completely fixated on managing the Middle East from that time on, right? But the only solution is to either reduce demand, which raising interest rates to 20% certainly would have, right? Because becoming unemployed means you've got less money to spend, right? But because the inelasticity of demand for oil is very high, there is just a limit to how low you can push the demand for an essential like oil. It's in everything. We wear it, we drive it, we burn it, we eat it, right? It's the universal product, right? With no real substitutes, and it's in every part of the economy. So there's just a limit to how low you can push that demand, without technological revolutions or something like that, right? So 20% unemployment, 20% interest rates, and he kept them there for 3 years, right? They might not have been what really brought the inflation down, right? But I digress. I'm getting ahead of myself. So for a big part of MMT, the playbook they have is they have what's called a jobs guarantee as an automatic economic stabilizer. So in much the same way as unemployment insurance, the dole works as an automatic stabilizer so that demand in the economy is still sort of maintained at a minimum level. MMT says that much of that can be replaced by a jobs program like FDR did, where the resources of a society are utilised for productive purposes. So a government job that pays minimum wages and is focused on using the surplus labour in the economy to build or do things that we need, right? So updating infrastructure is always needed, but lots of other things are possible too, right? This jobs guarantee, it's an automatic stabilizer because it fills out when the economy has a downturn. But then as the economy picks up and the private sector starts hiring again, because the jobs guarantee is maintained at minimum wages, right? The private sector can pay just a little bit more than minimum wages to entice workers back into the private economy. So it's an automatic stabilizer in that it improves society, right? A huge amount of FDR's New Deal construction is still the backbone of US infrastructure now. And I think if we focus spending on export-orientated industries, then we could avoid the stagnation associated with government-driven economies of the 80s and 90s, right? In Latin America and Africa, who tried to do import substitution. But if government deficit spending is focused on building competitiveness for exports rather than protecting domestic industries, that's an explanation for much of the Chinese boom and the Asian tigers, right? They've focused their entire economies on exports so that it becomes more efficient, right? Deficit spending for that sort of stuff would avoid state capture and the minimum wage type jobs. It would have to stay at minimum wage, right? Okay, so the battle between liberals and Keynesians will continue, and is continuing right up till now. Certainly MMT is an important update to Keynesian economics. It explains why counter-cyclical deficit spending, the kind of spending that is required to target full employment, right? Or 3-4% unemployment. It explains why that deficit spending isn't a problem and why spending to maintain but not go beyond full employment is non-inflationary. So I've tried to put the case for MMT as clearly as I can. It's certainly where the debate is again, right? Especially because the economy is viewed, if the economy is viewed through the neoliberal lens, through the neoliberal frame, all of the advanced economies are broke and the pension crisis is going to be a disaster. So I hope MMT is correct, though even if it is, the debate will rage on about how to spend it and what to spend it on and that sort of thing. I'm not sure I'm convinced by MMT. I think I probably am. There's certainly something almost scary about the idea of governments being released from the problem of worrying about deficits, right? So MMT correctly, I think, points out that government spending to create jobs, so the normal way is building infrastructure and things like that, but it doesn't have to be. It can be building laboratories and funding research and all sorts of things, right? So productive uses of people's time, right? That can be funded with deficit spending, right? But it's not. So MMT cures economics of the mistake of thinking that that in order to control inflation, you have to have this pool of unemployed people that are desperate to work, that operate as a brake on wages, right? So MMT explains in a nuanced, sophisticated way why that's not true, right? Why that's been a mistake. But it's not a magic wand, right? It comes with its own very real problems, right? In that, okay, MMT successfully, powerfully, I think, explains why the real limit on government spending is not anything except going above full employment, right? And that can be managed by keeping the government-funded jobs relatively at a minimum wage, or not, or at a minimum wage relative to the skills being utilised for the job that they're being employed for, right? So you've got to leave room for private industry to bid them away, to draw them away to the private economy, right? So if you do that, if you keep wages under control in the government sector, then you can control inflation, right? And as long as you don't start building too many bridges, right? But even if you do, if the wages are kept strictly at a reasonably low level for the skills employed, then those projects, once you hit full employment, you won't be able to find the people to fill those positions, right? Because the government jobs will always be paid less than the private job doing the same sort of thing, right? That's the trick. But MMT does a really powerful, really good job of explaining that. But what I don't think it even touches, really, I haven't found any MMT theorists really tackling it. I could be wrong, but is the problem that if government deficit spending has no limits from a debt sort of inflation side, right? So the limit, or the limit becomes political, right? So there is going to be massive political pressure on governments to win elections by promising that whole sections of the community will be bailed out from the need to work, right? So retirement ages will be brought lower and lower, and the funding for retirement will get more generous and more generous. And then maybe at the other end, right? So unemployment benefits, or maybe even a UBI, right? Like the battles we see now over banks or hedge funds, or large corporations that are supposedly too big to fail getting bailed out from their own mistakes. That kind of dynamic will be seen in everything, right? And that would be okay, right? I don't have any moral problem with people not working per se, right? But the problem is that the economy, the mass of us people, have a certain amount of demand that has to be met, right? For essentials and for normal needs or wants or whatever, right? And so if enough of the working population is being paid off to work less, or maybe not even work at all, then the efficiency of the economy, or the amount of stuff that's being produced by the economy, is going to be cut, and eventually you're going to cross a point where the economy can't produce enough stuff for what the population demands, right? And that's what will cause inflation, right? You'll have runaway inflation in certain goods, right? And so maybe we solve that with robotics and AI and all these, all this other stuff. But that is totally a discussion, a debate, a discussion worth having, right? Maybe we really can solve it with investment into robotics. Now that we understand that deficit spending, if used productively, not on buying people out for their votes, or bailing people out, or corruption, right? There's a vast amount of scope for corruption here. That's on lots of different levels, right? Like, that's my fear here. But perhaps if governments are able to exercise self-control, and that means not just governments, but us as a voting public need to ignore populists that are promising to buy our votes by using deficit spending in inefficient, unproductive ways. So I think MMT is a powerful argument. I can't find a fault in it, but it doesn't come. It's no free lunch, right? It doesn't come without an additional set of problems, another set of problems that politically we need to solve. Okay. Okay, well, you've made it through all the lectures. Well done. I hope you've enjoyed my historical presentation of international political economy. I've really enjoyed putting it together for you. So I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. But I just want to take this opportunity to wish you all the very best, all the best luck and good fortune possible in all your future endeavours. All right, thanks.